This time on Poll Hub, a view from the White House. Veteran White House correspondent Steve Thomma joins us to talk about the relationship between the media and the president, and not just Joe Biden, but presidents going all the way back to Ronald Reagan. Plus, what he makes of the new trend of some candidates refusing to deal with any journalists other than the friendly partisan ones. Oh, and he's also going to explain why Chicago is the best food city in America. And we're going to politely disagree. Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Maringoff.
And with us today is a guest, I think you've been on a couple, at least two Poll Hubs, maybe more. Steve Thomma, who is the executive director of the White House Correspondents Association, in town for a class tonight, Lee, correct?
And Seminar in political communication.
There you go. So we grabbed you and thought that this is an interesting time in Washington, and maybe we should be talking to you. Steve, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I want to note that I do not speak for the White House Correspondents Association. Our 9-member board speaks for us. I speak from my 40 years experience as a White House correspondent and political reporter dealing with the White House.
And that is what we value. Well, we value both, but we'll value the latter in this case. We have a lot of stuff that we want to ask you about, but I wanted to start with kind of this notion that White Houses treat the press in different ways, and there's generally some criticism of almost every White House. There was a lot of criticism of the Trump White House and how it handled the press. But there's a lot of criticism about the Biden White House and how it handles the press, the lack of one-on-one interviews, all these kinds of things. Is it the same story, different day, or are there really substantive differences, do you think, between the various White Houses that you have covered?
Absolutely. There's a difference. I would say a couple of things. I've been covering the White House since Ronald Reagan, second term. I'm not old enough to have covered the first term, but so I've been doing it since...
I'm old enough to remember the first term. Does that count?
I've been doing it since Reagan, and I say only half-jokingly, every White House has been worse than the one before for the press. And that is in part for a couple of reasons. One is changing technology has shifted the balance toward the White House. First, the ability to go live on television, the ability to do their own video and release it direct to the internet via Flickr or Tumblr, then Twitter, particularly in the Trump years, that came in the second term of Obama. All those gave the president and the White House staff the ability to go around the press or over the heads of the press and allegedly take their thoughts and message directly to the people without what they think is a burdensome filter of reporters. I say allegedly because what we find increasingly, and this is true of Twitter and particularly on Donald Trump, is they end up speaking mostly to their own supporters. They're not reaching a lot of undecided people or people in the middle who will decide not only the election, but could decide the course of legislation in the Congress. So the conversation has skewed to their favor. They think they try to cut out the press. This really started with Obama on video, and it accelerated with Trump with Twitter, and it is certainly a case with Biden.
So this isn't a Democrat or Republican thing?
Absolutely not. It is a two sources of power in our politics, both which were designed to have power. You know, I always like to point out, we all have jobs, but they put my job in the U.S. Constitution. It's there for a reason, because they thought wisely the press was an independent check on the power of the government. So those wise folks 230, 40 years ago decided somebody ought to be questioning the government and even criticizing them. And that's what we're there for. So Republican or Democrat alike, they don't like it when we do it, and we have to insist that we do it.
It's funny, the complaint about Biden is that he doesn't give enough news conferences or he hasn't done enough one-on-ones. Trump answered every question, or said he answered every question. He was out there all the time, but that was a different problem. Can you contrast the two administrations and how, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like in both cases, it's not really serving the American people.
Exactly. I would say one thing that's important about the Trump presidency to clarify is there were two parts of him on the press. One was his rhetoric, calling us the enemy of the people, calling it fake news, treating the press almost as treasonous or traitorous. I mean, traitors. And that rhetoric filtered into a lot of things, from threatening messages to actual threats to sometimes violence, in the case of the pipe bomber who sent a pipe bomb to some mailboxes. So that was one thing. On access, if you recall, Trump had a press conference in his first month or two, a full East Room, formal, stand at the podium, take a lot of questions. And then he didn't do one for months and months and months, and we weren't able to question him at all. And then I like to think there was a point at which, about the end of his first year, I think he remembered that he liked to talk, and he liked to hear himself talk. And all of a sudden, we got to ask Donald Trump questions almost every day. There are formal press conferences, like in the East Room, which is the biggest room in the White House, and the chandeliers, usually in prime time and national television. There's the White House briefing room where the press secretary has their briefings every day. They can do it in those venues. But they also, we call short exchanges, when they bring in a small group of us into the Oval Office just to get a picture of him with a foreign leader. We can shout out or yell a question or two. Those are important. And on the way to the helicopter, we're all out there on the South Lawn, the cameras, the reporters, yelling questions. He liked to stop. And it became such an issue rather rapidly. There were so many of us that he would be at one end of this line of reporters and cameras that the other end couldn't hear him. And it was actually a fair amount of work just to make sure all the cameras were behind and on their ladders, and the sound people were up front or had the extended boom mics. The writers were kneeling in front so that everyone could hear what the president said. But yeah, Donald Trump took a lot of questions. And then, if you remember, the last year was COVID, and he took over the daily COVID health briefing, which was 10 minutes of Anthony Fauci or Dr. Birx, and about an hour to an hour and a half of Donald Trump. And he took questions. Obviously, it's up to everyone else to decide whether he answered them or how well or truthfully he answered. That's not for me to decide. That's not for us to decide. But he took questions a lot. And so that was a good thing.
How much did the press have to wrestle with knowing that something was necessarily not true, not wanting to say the president was lying? How did that evolve within the press corps? Because I'm sure the press had to have lots of discussions, like when he says, starting with, I don't know, the inauguration was the biggest in our nation's history, and no one in the room necessarily shares that view. How do you cover that?
Yeah.
Are you just quoting the president said it, or do you have to insert the fact, which is not true, which is what's been happening with the election, whenever he says it was rigged, insert, which is not viewed as being, authentic or appropriate. How did you guys all wrestle with that kind of, like, when do we say what he's saying is real, and is he departing from the truth? It's very hard.
You've tapped into one of the absolute deep veins of journalistic debate over the last half century. And I think it really starts in the 60s and 70s when a generation, some of them a bit before me, had slowly come to the realization the government lies. Mm-hmm. Then the Pentagon Papers come out, and then we see it on paper that, oh my God, the president himself lies a lot about big things like Vietnam, and that was Kennedy and Johnson. It was before Nixon. And then Watergate comes through, and oh my God, they do lie. But, we never wrote that. You didn't see the word L, the president lied. Mm-hmm. And then it accelerates again in George W. Bush's White House when it starts to come out in good reporting by good, terrific journalists, that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that the cause to go to war was at best inflated and at worst was a manipulation of the truth or a lie. Mm-hmm. And still, there were debates then, I remember, should we call it a lie? That word lie, a lot of newsrooms just wouldn't go there. Mm-hmm. It assigned a motive. It assigned a level of, it was easier to say it was incorrect, it was misinformation, but the word lie didn't start till the Trump White House. And even then, I think a lot of newsrooms still took a year or two or three to come around to it. All of this comes at the same time in journalism. There's a debate that starts around the year 2000 about what we could call he said, she said journalism. That journalism shouldn't just report the president said X and the opponent said Y. that the journalist, the reporter, should tell the reader what is the truth between those two. And that's a subjective debate. I have my own opinion. I think it can be dangerous. I think there are times it's clear. You could say, the president, I won that election, and you could say, no, you didn't win that election. But there are a lot of times you can say things that are gray, and to always have the press tell you the truth is a little dangerous. So that all comes into, at the same time, the press is debating whether to start using the word lie. Now, I'd say in the last year, it's become very commonplace.
Yeah, as some things are just clearly not just misunderstanding, but a change with what the reality is, a shifting. I guess Conway called it not inappropriate. What was alternative facts?
Alternative fact was Kellyanne Conway's view in the first year. Yeah. Also, I think repetition bears into it. The notion that something could be a misstatement, or the political person, the president, the press secretary, could misread something once, maybe twice. But if they do it 10, 15, 20, 40 times, and you know they've been told or been briefed or have read that the opposite was true, I think people became more comfortable with the word lie.
Yeah, when I was just going to say, when I was growing up, we had the basic network coverage, and there were lots and lots of newspapers. But you had your ABC, NBC, and CBS evening news. And, of course, the Walter Cronkites and the Huntley Brinkleys, and et cetera. And now it's a totally different animal with, cable and social media and talk radio and all those things. Under which model do you feel is the public better served, or was it better served, 1970, or is it 50 years later when we have a whole different way of communicating?
I don't think I can measure that from the mountain I'm standing on, and here's why. It's in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, I think 3 networks were terrific in 1970, and 1 or 2 local newspapers in whatever city you worked in. But the newspaper's role was different. The journalist's role, the TV broadcasts were different. The people trusted those anchors. They don't trust them now, or they trust only the one they watch. So the landscape has changed, and a lot of that's for the benefit. Frankly, to have more voices is good. If, and this is what I say, I can't judge it from where I sit, if people are choosing to seek out more than one source. If you're watching only Fox or only MSNBC, you're not seeing this thing I'm seeing by watching both of them.
What do you make of candidates not talking to the press at all? Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania is a great example of this. But there are others. It seems like maybe it's the beginning of a trend, and it feeds off of a little bit what you talked about, which is politicians don't necessarily need us, the reporters, the journalists, to get their message out. What do you make of this?
They think they don't need us. Twitter's the example. We can go to Twitter. Donald Trump, when he was president and on Twitter, had 50, 60 million followers. It always bugged him that Obama had more, even as an ex-president. But I defy you to tell me how many of those Twitter followers weren't already his followers and weren't already going to agree. So they think they can do without talking to the press. But I've watched particularly the campaign for governor in Arizona closely, partly because I've always been intrigued by the state. And Kari Lake, the Republican, talks to the press a lot. She often, though, uses them as a foil. And
it's worth noting she was a TV anchor.
That's part of the reason
Phoenix.
She's so good at it.
Yeah.
She is very effective, but she does talk to them, and it gets coverage on her terms. So a Mastriano or someone who just says, I'm just not going to talk at all, we'll have to see what happens on Election Day and how that works out. I think in the end, you got to talk to somebody.
So do you sense that, though, that we've seen a decline in trust of a lot of institutions, and certainly the media is a really big one. What are the implications for the future of this democracy? And you can weigh in different ways, where you have candidates who may either use their own means of communication or use the press themselves to deny the fact that they lost the elections. I mean, we're headed towards the midterms, and it's mostly something we're seeing among Republican candidates, but even, Stacey Abrams, who's running in Georgia, has talked about voter suppression, and that, if she were to lose, she may not concede. How does the press handle those kinds of messages in the context of our politics now?
I'm not exactly sure I know the road forward or the right road forward. I do know we've been here before. We were here, when Thomas Jefferson was using leaks to his own partisan press to attack John Adams. We have been here before and gotten through it. The voters we didn't have a lot of voters back then.
Yeah, most of us couldn't vote.
Well, we also had the Electoral College, which was not based on voting. But
popular vote.
But we got through that. We've had times of deep partisan press, and I think we've moved back toward that. I mean, cable television led the way, driven by their audience, and they've created an audience, and they now, according to the reporting, are pretty candid internally about catering to their audience, not necessarily to the story. So we've survived it, and I know we're in a place where people seek out their own news. A lot of people. Not a lot of people watch two sources. It's too bad. We can preach, but they're not going to do it. And it'll be up to the voters if they're going to change course. I know that sounds like an easy way out for me, but only because it is an easy way out for me.
And you're our guest, so we're going to allow you.
But speaking about journalism, what might you hope? For instance, is this a false narrative in a sense that perhaps the exception was the last couple of decades that we remember to be objective journalism, and perhaps now we're just going back to the way journalism was done prior to that?
Yes, Barb. I think the last couple decades were an exception in the history of American journalism. We've had more years, I think, of partisan press. I grew up in Chicago. When I was a child, the Chicago Tribune, which was then one of four newspapers, but the dominant one, was a Republican paper. There was no doubt.
Yeah.
An overtly conservative Republican paper. And the Republicans knew that they would get a more favorable editorial at the Tribune. That happened before. This is not a new phenomenon. What is different is there are just more outlets, a lot more outlets, and less of a gatekeeper notion that if you can convince one of three television networks, you're going to get a third of the audience. Well, now there's hundreds of them. Some are flying high, and then they crash and burn. Look at One America News, which is crashing and burning as we speak. I spoke to them last time I was up here about a class and the effect of One America News and how Trump used them to leverage better coverage out of Fox. There are just a lot more. I do think the standard going forward still is objective reporting and journalism. I think the trust factor will remain. And I know there are a lot of big news organizations that are devoted to shedding the notion that they are partisan or ideological. And they're smarter people than I, but I think they also see the long-term path for them and for democracy is in objective reporting.
We do a lot of polling. We're told the polls are sometimes right, sometimes wrong, and everybody bemoans the notion of horse race journalism, that no matter what we do and say, who's ahead by how much, and is it more or less? Is there any way that, we try to bang our heads and talk about some of the issues that are on people's minds? I know when Jay was working at WNBC, they did a whole series on Issues Matter. Do you feel that frustration sometimes that, what you're learning a lot from the polls and the media coverage is the horse race, who's ahead, and not necessarily where the public is on issues, and that might help perhaps drive campaign discussion a little bit? Would that elevate it?
Yes, I feel that. I mean, for me, both as a political journalist and as a citizen, I like both. I want to know who's ahead, then I want to know why they're ahead. And not just how much they spend on television, but is it because that state or district is rebelling against the court decision on abortion rights? Is it because the tax situation has just turned south? Is it because immigrants are pouring into a liberal northern city and have changed the political equation? So I've always wanted to see both in the same story. I think polling is important, not just for the horse race, but for the issues. And I have to tell you, I made my life out of this, but I don't actually want to read every issue. But I want to know the top issues, and I want to know where the candidates stand and how it's affecting them.
Yeah.
And how they stand is affected by the polling.
Yeah.
I think it should be part of the whole picture.
Yeah. That's I think, a very fair answer, because it's just something that we we feel frustrated by. And then also, if you just do the number one issue, everybody thinks that is the only issue, whereas maybe there's lots of things that make up an issue map for people. But
what about
we
this
move
issue?
on.
What about that
well,
issue
this
right
is an important
there?
issue. So in 1955, the Gallup poll, I was a mere 4-year-old at that time, and I don't think anybody else here was
Alive.
anything. So Gallup and our friends at the Roper Center always have these archives that we like to dip into. So in 1955, Gallup asked a national audience of 1,545 Americans, from what you've heard, read, or think, which large city in the United States, drumroll, has the best food? Here's what they said. 1955, New York. This is a hometown crowd here, so 24%. Second place was Chicago, your hometown, at 7%. And then things like New Orleans and San Francisco and L.A. and all the way down to Boston at 2%, which obviously doesn't have wonderful food at all. So to what do you attribute...
Yeah, that's not a Yankee bias.
To what do you attribute... We're going to talk about hot dogs in a second, I think, but to what do you attribute, as a Chicagoan, why New York is so popular, at least in 1955, when it came to food?
People were just wrong. They were just wrong.
They're just wrong.
Chicago's numbers should be much higher.
Okay.
It has terrific food, unique food.
Yeah.
Hot dogs are one. Italian beef is another. Deep dish pizza, which was not invented in 1955, so that could skew the results. And also, I have to say, Boston has really good food.
Yeah.
Legal Seafoods is still one of my favorite restaurants.
I've been there.
Except for the Red Sox fans, it's a great city. And so I think those numbers are just plain wrong. You've taught me, you and Barb, that 95% of the time a poll is pretty close, but 5% of the time it's just flat garbage.
Yeah.
I think that was a garbage.
And the theory allows it. Yeah.
Well, also add up all the numbers, and you don't get to anywhere close to 100%. So a lot of people must be a lot of long tail 1%, or a lot of people said, I don't know.
Yeah.
But this is also 1955. I mean, we've changed as a country food-wise. I mean, we're much more aware of food. All the shows on TV about food and all this other stuff. I think if we were to do this poll again, which we could include it on a national poll, we could see if Chicago could come up in the rankings. It's not going to get to New York, but we could see, Steve.
There's another important factor, and I know this. I remember my dad, because we traveled a lot around the United States. Is food was more regional then.
Yeah.
Chain restaurants, but also travel and the ability of jets to deliver fresh seafood to Kansas City and fresh steaks from Kansas City to Charlotte changed all that. My dad you'd mention a city in the country, and he'd say, I remember the toast, I remember the corned beef, I remember whatever. That's all gone because everything is the same everywhere.
So what would we still remember about Chicago's food?
Well, it just has fantastic hot dogs. I like hot dogs almost everywhere.
Why are Chicago hot dogs better or different than New York hot dogs?
Well, New York has hot dogs. They're not very good.
We have real hot dogs.
All right, well, let me get into the middle of this. Would you describe what? It's not just the hot dog; it's what goes on.
Oh,
the
it's
hot
not
dog.
just the hot dog, but they're all the same brand. Vienna beef is the brand, same hot dog. Anywhere of 18,000 hot dog places in Chicago, on the same poppy seed bun, which you cannot find on the East Coast. I've searched; it's not right. And if one politician in this country would ever address this, they'd have my vote for life.
And the industrial Midwest has become very important politically, and they're not.
Not as important as they used to be honest, and that's probably part of the reason. But this poppy seed question, do you hear Biden, Trump, Obama, any of them talking about it?
Haven't
Never.
heard a word. Haven't heard a word.
And then you've got to have the neon green relish and mustard. You have celery salt. That's unique to Chicago hot dogs. Then they add, I don't always have everything, peppers. On top of the relish, which is sweet, they have a dill pickle spear, and then 2 slices of tomato.
It's a meal.
It is a meal.
A hot dog in New York is not a meal. You need 2 or 3 of them.
I didn't hear the word
Chicago dog
sauerkraut
is
in
a
there. Did I
meal
miss
there.
that?
Sauerkraut. Lee, you scare me.
So give us a lesson on Chicago beef because for 2 reasons. One, there's a very popular show on TV right now about a restaurant, a Chicago beef restaurant. And then one of my ex-roommates lives in New York, ships in from, I don't know what the restaurant is, they ship in Chicago beef, the bread and the frozen meat. He ships it in.
Oh, I need to know about that because I don't have that information.
So why is Chicago beef? What is it? What is this?
It's not Chicago. It's called Italian beef.
Italian beef in Chicago. Yeah.
Yeah,
What's
very
what?
common. A lot of, it must be hundreds of places that sell it, street corner places. And Italian beef is roast beef, sliced thin. It's the spice in the juice. It's a spicing that's unique. I just saw a picture pop up on one of the Chicago Twitter feeds I follow, and it's a picture from a grocery store in about 1968, 69. And I blew it up to look at every item that was on the belt, and there was gaucho frozen Italian beef, which my mom used to buy because you could cook it yourself. And I commented on that. I've had dozens and dozens and dozens of people agreeing. Yeah, it's the spice.
And it's on like white bread, right?
No, sub roll.
Sub roll, yeah. And it's just the beef. Is there toppings on that?
Yeah,
or?
some Philistines add stuff, but. It's still a free country. It is still free country, isn't it?
Yeah.
Before we end this, what has been perhaps the most informative, from many ways, podcast that I can recall, I want to talk about bagels before we leave the topic. Now, in New York, there are bagels, and if we export them, we still think that they show up and they're called New York bagels, because why would you market a Chicago bagel? So tell me, you go out in Chicago, there's a bagel you want. What are you getting?
A bagel.
Just a bagel, not a New York bagel.
I've never heard it called a New York bagel. I'll concede that. I'll trade our superiority, Chicago I mean, in hot dogs, Italian beef, pizza, impressionist art. I mean, through architecture.
He hasn't named
for the
baseball
one
yet,
thing
Lee.
you have, which is bagels.
Okay.
And a couple of World Series rings along the decades.
And maybe the
yeah,
I think
the
the Giants
bagels are
beat the
great.
Bears earlier in the season, and we didn't even bet on that. It's
No, we didn't.
unfortunate.
Yeah, the Bears don't exist.
Well, Steve Thomma, Executive Director of the White House Correspondents Association, not here representing the White House Correspondents Association, but instead talking from your long, illustrious history and journey in journalism, in political journalism in America. Thanks for joining us again. You are probably our most frequent guest, and I think that is a undeniably good thing.
And we covered a lot of different ground, particularly in the second segment. Thank you, Steve.
My pleasure.
That'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them directly to @MaristPoll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it will cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as we release it.
We'll see you next time.